Now, what gives this bill its magical power?
To get back to Godhead, to get back to the spiritual world.
The world appears antagonistic to one who's seeking a spiritual path. The mundane world and achieving material success, having that good job, having wealth, so forth, seems like it's always battling with this other-mindedness of seeking a sort of spiritual fulfillment, salvation, what have you. These two aspects seem to be butting heads in variant forms throughout history. And this battle is summarized by two words, Zion and Babylon. Babylon is the main focus of this session, this essence of the ancient past that seemed, by esoteric interpretation and by Christian interpretation, to be an abomination of this world. So what happened? What changed in Babylon? What changed the trajectory of mankind there? And in addition, what does this say about the modern world? First, we should point out our grounds for this investigation. When using the term Zion in Babylon, we're acknowledging the Rastafarian orientation towards this subject. The Rastafarians use Babylon as a term because of its biblical reference. The Jews were enslaved by Babylon. This then is an oppressive essence of the world, the empire that oppresses a people and enslaves them. In this same regard, the Rastafarians related to this because of the history of how their people came to be in Jamaica. We should notice this theme right away. This is the heart of the issue. This dehumanization and the innate oppression that comes from power structures. Zion, then, in this understanding, is the opposite. It is a re-embracing of our ancestral way of being. The Promised Land, then, is in accordance to what religious center we have, what that looks like, and where that is. But for our purposes, we should note that Babylon is not something that is purely designating the area or that specific time in history. It is this overarching abstract essence or spirit that has taken over mankind since Babylon. So you might see this news story or you might see this attribute come out of somebody and you say, that's Babylon, in that it's the same essence, it's the same orientation, it's the same spirit that has followed us throughout history. Again, dehumanization, exploitation, and power. So if this started in Babylon, then what is it, or what happened to bring this about in the world? Babylon was not the beginning of, quote, civilization or agriculture, so it's not purely society in this way, but it is the beginning of overpopulation, empire, and bureaucracy. Now, when I say overpopulation, I'm referring to having variant peoples from variant groups, cultural groups, that are all put under the same banner. In this way, these variant cultures cannot all be mutually honored as they would be in their indigenous chieftains. In this way, it's no accident that we see the invention of law. If you know the history of law, then you'd see that these early codes come most notably from Hammurabi, and that is Babylon. It gets revised further and further into the future by Rome, by Magna Carta into the modern day, but these laws were always put in place because of this dehumanization and bureaucratic factor. The ancient ancestral way had no need for law. Law was enforced mutually by the becoming of people. Whereas, when you have a society, a bureaucratic society, you need to enforce these statements, or quote, laws, in order to subjugate these variant peoples that can't all be honored. To run with great power means that you need it to be propped up by innumerable nameless people in all of their labors. And so the seeking of power then necessitates this subjugation. With this inclination, with this drive at the heart of this society, it's no accident that the Jews were enslaved. A much more centered or direct way to speak to this effect is asking, how many people can you genuinely know? How many people can you genuinely be connected with? At what point in a certain number of population do you completely sacrifice any feeling of community, and now these are all just nameless bodies that take up your parking spot? At what point do we start to think of people as objects, as annoyances, and completely dehumanize them? At what metric of population does that take place? In the ancient world, we had groupings. We had an orientation and a belongingness in those groups. And so just there, is where we could retain this mutual humanity. But as soon as Babylon comes about, it enunciates this divorce from that, this distance from that connection and from that belongingness, not just with our own people, but also our own religion, our own spirituality, and our own belongingness in this world. What we're calling Babylon is in fact starting with the Akkadian Empire. And what the Akkadians do is they take over the Sumerians and they take all of their culture and absorb it into their own. This is another distinction of this Babylon essence, this appropriation of other cultures into its own framework. To will for this greater amalgam of power would mean that appropriation, but logistically, you have all these people to feed, you have to arm them, you have to have society function enough to manifest this power of empire, and accordingly, you will have bureaucracy. This will necessitates bureaucracy, the red tape, the amalgam of accounting records, this person owes this person this much money, the creation of debt, the creation of banking, all this is necessitated by this amalgam. So in this way, Babylon invented middlemen. You no longer know the farmer, where you get your food from. You have a merchant in the way. You no longer deal directly with your metallurgist. You have a merchant in the way. Now, this isn't to say that the mechanisms of society are inherently oppressive, but it is to say that it gives way so naturally to this oppressive essence. This all, though, comes from a fundamental shift in philosophy, in the way that human beings are perceiving the world. In our ancient ancestral peoples, we had much more validity of our subjective experience of the world. You and your experience of the world, your dreams, your visions, your ceremonies, they all were your modus operandi and your people's modus operandi when it comes to relating to existence. All of these peoples as well, indigenous and onward, Prioritize the spiritual, relating not just to yourself and to your people, but also to the world, in respecting it and making sure that you're giving back what you're taking by ceremony, or at the very least by acknowledgement. But here in Babylon, this mentality is moving towards a much more computational, materialistic way of relating. We have X amount of mouths and we need X amount of food to feed those mouths. And the means by which that these resources are procured is irrelevant. So this is a much more nihilistic orientation, a much more corporeal orientation toward the world. You are no longer a human, you are a number to be accommodated to in an allocating sort of fashion. So here, notice, you no longer know where your food is coming from. You no longer know what it's comprised of. You no longer know of its ways of relating to the world. There is a separation between that product and its production. I hope that comes across. All of this serves this greater power amalgamation, this appropriating of various peoples, of various cultures in order to facilitate empire. And so then, with this context given, it's not strange at all to happen across the story of the Tower of Babel. In this, it is a display, an allegory of the hubristic nature of Babylon. Babel is an interesting word etymologically speaking. There are two main interpretations here. One would point out the Bab-ilu root, which would mean the gate of God, but perhaps more appropriately, there is the Babel, which would mean to confuse. And this survives in many fashions. When you say that you're babbling, or when a child tends to make their first sounds, they ba, and so thus the babbling. This gate of God reference is intriguing in the sense that the story goes that this tower is trying to transgress on the heavens. It is trying to go further than it was ever meant to go. The story of Icarus is the same sort of mythic story. Although in mythology, it's not super common to get the story of why languages diasporaed. I think an undermentioned morale of this story is that we are given an upper limit to our fooling around. Let's just say it that way. We are given an invisible ceiling to this hubristic enterprise that we're on about. The power structures will give way to decay. The further they reach, the further they'll fall, kind of a thing. There seems to be an invisible metaphysical ceiling to our transgression into things that we ought not interfere with. If you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes, kind of a thing. And in this very similar fashion, Babylon falls. With all of the hubristic reaching and oppression that Babylon brought to the earth, it fell. But then that gave way to the Mycenaeans. That gave way to the ancient Egyptians. This idea, this way of relating, and this will to power would begin slowly to swallow the earth. So this is a proverbial torch that has been passed. When one empire falls, another one swallows it, and the concentration of that power attempts to become ever more concentrated. And in this story, the self has been sacrificed for this superficial unification. This unification is not sincere, authentic, and offers no sense of genuine human belonging. This yearning and this craving to be seen, felt, and to have agency is sacrificed for power. So the people are now rethinking themselves. The self is being reinvented, recontextualized. The negative connotations that come along with this power structure begin to blossom and blossom and blossom. You have corruption, politics, police, laws. All of this comes from the Babylon or from the babbling. And as a poetic flourish to this whole thing, all of these structures are made up. Our reality was our ancestral way of being, was a beingness with the earth. Our reverence was to things that are actually real and of this world. The earth, the crops, the sun. But now, this is all Babel, in the sense that we are paying homage, we are worshiping the laws given by governments, we are worshiping the politicians or the kings that are handed down through institutions. These elements are the babbling. So these mechanisms that come out of this bureaucracy, of this society, of this power structure, they come out of necessity. So is there any voice of resistance against this amalgam? And that is the role of spiritual traditions before they become religions. And we'll point that out here. This isn't just a story of Christianity, but I do want to use Christianity as an example. I want to make the point that Christianity talks about this and has this, quote, anti-establishment mentality. If you want to look at the book of Revelations, you'll find the harlot of Babylon, and it has quotes such as, having a golden cup in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication, or upon her forehead a name is written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. Or another, and unto me he said, the waters which thou saw, where the whore sit, are peoples, are multitudes, are nations and tongues. All of this speaks to this amalgam that I've been attempting to illustrate. The enemy that is referred to here is the amalgam of empire. And I understand there are many ways of interpreting these lines, but it makes it clear that this is a torch that is handed off to many different kings, to multitudes, to many different nations, and to many different tongues. This desire toward wealth, this greed. And so here in the New Testament, in Matthew, Jesus shows up to the temple, and what does he do? He enters and he flings the table because he realizes that those that are in this church are not doing the sacred things. They're turning it into a den of robbers. And so here is that distinction between the spiritual quest of restoring this earth, of reaching fulfillment, not just for yourself, but for others, and what people do with the power structures of religion. The power structures of religion is the, quote, den of robbers. And just as a very brief look into modern religion or into mega churches, this is very apparent. If we want to go to the Old Testament, then we can look to Leviticus and Exodus as they point out that the act of usury or charging interest for goods, in other words, modern day banking, is heresy, is blasphemous. And so here we have to point it out. Does the Vatican participate in usury? Do churches participate in usury? And if so, is this not a distinction between the spirituality that is genuinely sought by the earnest Christian and the power structure of the church? This is a complicated subject. Where one ends and another begins is the frustrating nuance of what it means to navigate this world. When this greed becomes of us, when we cannot excuse ourselves for our participation and our perpetuation of this Babylon, you see. And when instead we should completely renounce ourselves from those mechanisms. When it comes to Christianity, there is another intriguing way to name and to look at this subject. We have used the term Babylon to designate this subject, but there's also Mammon in the Bible. In the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Luke, we find these references to Mammon, which in Hebrew means money or wealth. Quote, either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold on to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and Mammon. So here is that line in the sand. Here is that sharp distinction that we've been speaking to. Serving the material world or serving your aspiration towards spiritual salvation, fulfillment, what have you. This word has reoccurred throughout European languages, whether it's Finnish or Slavic or German, so forth, all of them designate money or wealth with this word. Money, mammon. Later, church fathers would interpret this reference as a demon and would be designated as one of the 7 princes of hell. And so, modern reverence, modern success of being wealthy, of accumulating wealth, this is demonic if we're being strict about it. This seeking of material gain is antithetical to the spiritual quest. As Jesus says in the Bible, you cannot serve both. So in a reasonable fashion, but in a somewhat sensational way of saying, this is the God of the modern world, placated and giving lip service to at every wake and turn. This is Mammon. This is the God of the modern world. Money, the adoration, the reverence of wealth. How everybody wants it, everybody needs it, everybody should do anything that they can to go and get it. This is Babel. The structural systems that have furthered and furthered and furthered throughout time to the point that this is now global. This orientation and this seeking, this mammon could be said to be inspired by Pluto, and Pluto was the god of material wealth. So you could very readily say that the world is in fact a plutaltry, this word meaning those who worship wealth, those who worship money, those who would sacrifice lives on the altars of commerce. I have framed this all with the Christian lens, but this is not uniquely Christian. Any earnest spirituality would have something to say in this regard. We can look to Daoism. Several quotes throughout the Tao Te Ching and throughout the works of Zhuangzhou says things like, those who know when they have enough are rich. Or, the wise man knows that it is better to sit on the banks of a remote mountain stream than to be the emperor of the whole world. This is in pursuit of fulfillment. It is not in pursuit of the glamours of the world. In Hinduism and in Buddhism, as a broader stroke, they would refer to this greed, this seeking, as a mental poison. It is one of the poisons that set people off the path. And in this, to designate it as a poison means that it not only poisons you, but it poisons everybody. It consumes your good health and life. This will for power, or this lust for power, is an addiction, in that it's never enough. So that will to have just a little bit more is what makes empires, is what makes Babel, is what makes the systems of oppression that would enslave continuously. And even in these variant spiritualities, for instance, in Hinduism, you can see such an uptick in worshiping or giving lip service to Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth. And why would she be given more of a podium than she has historically been given? Well, here it is. It is that materialism working its way into the spirituality and leading it towards that discourse into, let's just call it religion as a word of convenience, to instead get off the path of seeking your fulfillment and instead handing yourself over to materialistic pursuit. This infection of spiritual traditions, it can be its own session. It goes all around. But of course, most naturally, we can think of the prosperity gospel movements in the United States, where they'll take lines from Psalms that say things like, "Take delight in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart." To take this earnest seeking of that spiritual becoming and make that desire instead one of consumerism is very convenient for an American or modern Western culture. To try to marry this materialistic consumptive nature with that of a spiritual seeking is all too convenient, as though those things could be earnestly married. And so I have to ask the same thing that I've asked before in the course. The issue isn't the mechanisms by which these things come to be manifested. It is the very dream. It's the aim that we wish to bring to these things. You want to feel abundant. You want to feel like you have enough. And so you ask for material things. The plot has been lost. We are astray in this way. To bring it back to point, the Rastafarian aspiration is that we go to a place where we are living in harmony, and that cannot be attained by this desire to control everything. This desire to control everything and to have more is the infection of this world. That is what has brought us to this point of desperate inhumanity, alienation. There are unnamed, innumerable people in our ancient history and in our modern age who are acting against this, who would will for this to be different, for the betterment of everybody, in more ways than we can imagine. A great revival, a redemption, a return, a reprieve from this. Our yearning, our will to escape, and this quiet feeling that there's something very wrong about all of this, we now have words for. Babel. It's all babbling. The babbling that's taken over the world. It's pertinent to point out that the great beasts, the apocalyptic visions given in the variant texts of the Bible, these great beasts, these great amalgams, these great egregores are the empires. It is this very subject. These concentrations of power, in hopes that this infection eventually means that humanity will gain a degree of immunity to it. that it will not run the culture like an infection does. The culture, the bacteria, infected. It's so easy to throw your hands up and know that you're so small in comparison to these mighty institutions, these aggregates that are so beyond you. But those institutions would not exist if it wasn't for this way of thinking, this way of approaching people, this way of approaching the world, and this idea of what success means. And so instead, to get to the heart of the issue, we have to think differently, not give way to the babbling. This call, this drive, is the unification of all spiritual traditions. All spiritual traditions agree that this seeking, this gain, this material gain, this idea of success is 100% not the way. And so if instead we are desiring to rectify this quiet wrongness that we feel, if instead we want to rectify the horrors of the world, that we don't wish to see this degree of insane dehumanization that is inherent in this sort of orientation, then we need to change the thought. We need to follow that and honor that to the best of our abilities. We all are speaking the different languages because when the tower fell, it all made us think we're different. The unifying language is the opposite of Babel.
And you try to change that, try to change those habit sets, those mindsets, and you bring down upon yourself the wrath of a terror, really.
The Spiritual Studies course is an effort towards free public education on matters of spirituality, comparative religion, and philosophy sometimes, along with other humanities. This session was brought to you by the various members that support this initiative on the Buy Me Coffee link in the description box below. Benefits for membership are various micro sessions, so a number of different subjects that YouTube never sees, commentaries on each of these sessions, updates on what's coming up next, and the names, acknowledgement, the thanks, and the furtherment of this course and everything that it wishes to provide. If you appreciate this effort, if you appreciate the way that this is approached, these subjects, then consider buying me a coffee. That just simply helps this course have more sessions and to get out there further for more people to see and to experience and to benefit from. With that said, thank you for attending. Stay curious and keep wondering.